Our first story for the night, Bluebeard. All enough, not about a pirate. There's a pirate movie called Bluebeard, but no, that's entirely different. Anyway, Bluebeard. There was a man who had fine houses, both in town and country, a deal of silver and gold plate, embroidered furniture with coaches gilded all over with gold. Thank you. This man was so unlucky as to have a blue beard, which made him so frightfully ugly, hey, what's wrong with the beard, that all the women and girls ran away from him. One of his neighbors, a lady of quality, had two daughters who were perfect beauties. He desired of her one of them in marriage, leaving her to choose which of the two she would bestow on him. They would neither of them have him, and sent him backward and forward from one another, not being able to bear the thoughts of marrying a man who had a blue beard. He's rich, babes. What are you complaining about? And what besides gave him the disgust and aversion was his having already been married to several wives, you downer, and nobody ever knew what became of them. Ah. Bluebeard, to engage their affection, took them, with the lady their mother, and 3 or 4 ladies of their acquaintance, with other young people of the neighborhood, to one of his country seats, where they stayed a whole week. There was nothing then to be seen but parties of pleasure, hunting, fishing, dancing, mirth, because mirth is good, and feasting, which is also good. And nobody went to bed, but all passed the night rallying and joking with each other. Sounds like a good weekend. In short, everything succeeded so well that the youngest daughter began to think the master of the house not to have a beard so very blue, and that he was mighty civil gentleman. As soon as they returned home, the marriage was concluded. About a month afterwards, Bluebeard told his wife that he was obliged to take a country journey for 6 weeks at least, about affairs of very great consequence, desiring her to divert herself in his absence, to send for her friends and acquaintances to carry them into the country if she pleased, and to make good cheer wherever she was. Here, he said, are the keys to the 2 great wardrobes, wherein I have my best furniture, and all the silver and gold plate, which is not every day in use. These open my strong boxes, which hold my money, both gold and silver. These are caskets of jewels, and this is the master key to all my apartments. But for this little one here, it is the key to the closet at the end of the great gallery on the ground floor. Open all of them, go into every one of them, except the little closet, which I forbid you, and forbid it in such a manner, if you happen to open it, there's nothing but what you may expect from my just anger and resentment. She promised to observe very exactly whatever he had ordered, when he, having embraced her, got into the coach and proceeded on his journey. Her neighbors and good friends did not stay to be sent by the new married lady, so great was her impatience to see all the rich furniture of the house, not daring to come while her husband was there, because of his blue beard, which frightened them. How you doing? Glad you came in. They ran through all the rooms, closets, and wardrobes, which were all so fine and rich that they seemed to surpass one another. After that, they went up to the 2 great rooms, where was the best and richest furniture. They could not sufficiently admire the number and beauty of the tapestry, beds, couches, cabinets, stands, tables, and looking-glasses in which you might see yourself from head to foot. Some of them were framed with glass, others with silver, plain and gilded, the finest and most magnificent ever were seen. You're welcome. They ceased not to extol the envy and happiness of their friend, who in the meantime in no way diverted herself into looking upon all these riches, because of the impatience she had to go and open the closet to the ground floor. She was so much pressed by her curiosity, without considering that it was very uncivil to leave her company. She went down the little back staircase, and with such excessive haste that she had twice or thrice like to have broken her neck. Go ran downstairs. On being come to the closet door, she made to stop for some time, thinking upon her husband's orders, and considering what unhappiness might attend her if she were disobedient. But the temptation was so strong that she could not overcome it. She then took the little key and opened it, trembling, but could not at first see anything plainly, because the windows were shut. After some moments, she began to perceive that the floor was all covered over with clotted blood, on which lay the bodies of several dead women, ranged against the wall. These were the wives whom Bluebeard had married and murdered, one after another. Though she should have died for fear, and the key which she pulled back out of the lock fell out of her hand. After having somewhat recovered her surprise, she took up the key, locked the door, and went upstairs to her chamber to recover herself. But she could not. She was so much frightened. Having observed that the key of the closet was stained with blood, she tried 2 or 3 times to wipe it off, but the blood would not come off of it. In vain she did wash it, and even rub it with soap and sand. The blood still remained, for the key was magical, and she could never make it quite clean. When the blood was gone off from one side, it came again on the other. Bluebeard returned from his journey that same evening, and said he had received letters upon the road, informing him that the affair he went about was ended to his advantage. His wife did all she could to convince him that she was extremely glad of his speedy return. Next morning he asked her for the keys, which she gave him, but with such a trembling hand that he easily guessed what had happened. "What?" he said. "Is not the key of my closet among the rest?" "I must certainly have left it above upon the table," she said. "Fail not," said Bluebeard. "Bring it to me presently." After several going backwards and forwards, she was forced to bring him the key. Bluebeard, having very attentively considered it, said to his wife, "How come this blood upon the key?" "I do not know," cried the poor woman, paler than death. "You do not know?" replied Bluebeard. "I very well know. You were resolved to go into the closet, were you not? Mighty well, madam. You shall go in, and take your place among the ladies you saw there." Upon this she threw herself at her husband's feet, and begged his pardon with all the signs of true repentance, vowing that she would never more be disobedient. She would have melted a rock, so beautiful and so sorrowful she was, but Bluebeard had a heart harder than any rock. "You must die, madam," he said, "and that presently." "Since I must die," answered she, looking upon him with her eyes bathed all in tears, "give me some little time to say my prayers." I give you, replied Bluebeard, half a quarter of an hour, but not 1 moment more. When she was alone, she called out to her sister and said to her, Sister Anne, for that was her name, go up, I beg you, upon the top of the tower, and look if my brothers are not coming. They promised that they would come by today, and if you see them, give them a sign to make haste. Her sister Anne went up on top of the tower, and the poor afflicted wife cried out from time to time, Anne, Sister Anne, do you see anyone coming? And Sister Anne said, I see nothing but the sun, which makes a dust, and the grass, which looks green. In the meanwhile, Bluebeard, holding a great saber in his hand, cried out as loud as he could bawl for his wife, Come down instantly, or I shall come up to you. One moment longer, if you please, said his wife, and then she cried out very softly, Anne, Sister Anne, dost thou see anybody coming? And Sister Anne answered, I see nothing but the sun, which makes a dust, and the grass, which is green. Come down quickly, cried Bluebeard, or I will come up to you. I am coming, answered his wife, and then she cried, Anne, Sister Anne, dost thou see anyone coming? I see, replied Sister Anne, a great dust, which comes on the side here. Are they my brothers? Alas, no, my dear sister. I see a flock of sheep. Will you come down? Cried Bluebeard. A moment longer, said his wife, and then she cried out, Anne, Sister Anne, dost thou see nobody coming? I see, she said, 2 horsemen, but they are yet a great deal way off. God be praised, replied the poor wife joyfully. They are my brothers. I will make them a sign, as well as I can, for them to make haste. Then Bluebeard bawled out so loud that he made the whole house tremble. The distressed wife came down and threw herself at his feet, all in tears, with her hair about her shoulders. This signifies nothing, says Bluebeard. You must die. Then, taking a hold of her hair with one hand, lifting up the sword with the other, he was going to take off her head. The poor lady, turning about to him, and looking him with her dying eyes, desired him to afford her one little moment to recollect herself. No, no, he said. Recommend thyself to God. And just as he was about to strike, at the very instant there was such a loud knocking at the gate that Bluebeard made a sudden stop. The gate was opened, and presently entered 2 horsemen, who, drawing their swords, ran directly to Bluebeard. He knew them to be his wife's brothers, one a dragoon, and the other a musketeer, so that he ran away immediately to save himself. But the 2 brothers pursued so close that they overtook him before he could get to the steps of the porch, when they ran their swords through his body and left him dead. The poor wife was almost dead as her husband, and had not strength enough to rise to welcome her brothers. Bluebeard had no heirs, and so his wife became mistress of all his estate. She made use of one part of it to marry her sister Anne to a young gentleman who had loved her a long while, another part to buy captain's commissions for her brothers, and the rest to marry herself to a very worthy gentleman who made her forget the ill time she had passed with Bluebeard. Okay, yeah, so ugly guy, loaded, apparently a multiple widower because he killed his wives. Yeah, good stories. Let's tell kids more of these. Yeah. And they love a good fairy tale. Anyway, our next wonderful story, The Princess on the Glass Hill. Once upon a time, there was a man who had a meadow which lay on the side of a mountain, and in the meadow there was a barn in which he stored hay. But there had not been much hay in the barn for the past 2 years, for every St. John's Eve, when the grass was the height of its vigor, it was all eaten up, just as if a whole flock of sheep had gnawed it down to the ground during the night. This happened once, and it happened twice. But then the man got tired of losing his crop, and said to his sons, he had 3 of them. The third one was called Cinderlad, or Ashlad, depending on which country you're in, that one of them must go to sleep in the barn on St. John's night, for it was absurd to let grass be eaten up again, blade and stalk, as it had been for the last 2 years. And the one who went must keep a sharp watch out, said the man. The eldest was quite willing to go to the meadow. He would watch the grass, he said, and he would do it so well that neither man nor beast, nor even the devil himself, should have any of it. See where this is going. So, when evening came, he went to the barn and lay down to sleep. But when night was drawing near, there was such a rumbling and such an earthquake that the walls and roof shook again. And the lad jumped up and took to his heels as fast as he could, and never even looked back, and the barn remained empty that year, just as it had been the last 2. Next St. John's Eve, the man again said that he could not go on this way, losing all the grass in the outlying field year after year, and that one of his sons must go there and watch it, and watch well, too. So the next oldest son was willing to show what he could do. He went to the barn and lay down to sleep, as his brother had done. But when night was drawing near, there was a great rumbling, and then an earthquake, which was even worse than that of the former St. John's night. And when the youth heard it, he was so terrified, and went off, running as if on a wager. The year after, it was Cinderlad's turn, but when he made ready to go, the others laughed at him and mocked him. Well, you are just the right one to watch the hay, you who have never learnt anything but how to sit among the ashes and bake yourself, I said. Cinderlad, however, had no trouble himself about what they said, but when evening drew near, rambled away to the outlying field. When he got there, he went into the barn and lay down. But in about an hour's time, the rumbling and creaking began, and it was frightful to hear. Well, if it gets no worse than that, I can manage to stand it, thought Cinderlad. In a little time after, the cracking began, and the earth quaking so that all the hay flew about the boy. Oh, if it gets no worse than that, I can manage to stand it, thought Cinderlad. But then came a third rumbling, and a third earthquake, so violent that the boy thought the walls and roof had fallen down. But when that was over, everything suddenly grew as still as death around him. I'm pretty sure that it will come again, thought Cinderlad. But no, it did not. Everything was quiet, and everything stayed quiet. And when he had lain a short time still, he heard something that sounded as if a horse were standing chewing just outside the barn door. He stole away to the door, which was ajar, to see what it was there, and a horse was standing eating. It was so big and fat, and a fine a horse that Cinderlad had never seen one like it before, and the saddle and bridle lay upon it, and a complete suit of armor for a knight, and everything was of copper, and so bright that it shone again. Ha ha! Is it thou who eats up all our hay, then? Thought the boy. But I will stop that. So he made haste, and took out his steel for striking fire, and threw it over the horse, and then it had no power to stir from the spot, and became so tame that the boy could do what he liked with it. So he mounted it, and rode away to a place which no one knew of but himself, and there he tied it up. When he went home again, his brothers laughed and asked how he got on. "You didn't lie in the barn long, even if you had been there so far as the field," said they. "I lay in the barn till the sun rose, but I saw nothing and heard nothing, and not I," said the boy. "God knows what there was to make you two so frightened." "Well, we shall soon see whether you have watched the meadow or not," answered his brothers. And when they got there, the grass was all standing just as long and as thick as it had been the night before. The next St. John's Eve it was the same thing. Once again, neither of the two brothers dared to go to the outlying field to watch the crop. But Cinderlad went, and everything happened exactly the same as on the previous St. John's Eve. First there was a rumbling and an earthquake, and then there was another, and then a third. But all three earthquakes were much, very much more violent than they had been the year before. Then everything became still as death again, and the boy heard something chewing outside the barn door. So he stole so softly as he could to the door, which was slightly ajar, and again there was a horse standing close by the wall of the house, eating and chewing, and it was far larger and fatter than the first horse, and it had a saddle on its back, and a bridle was on it too, and a full suit of armor for a knight, all of bright silver, and as beautiful as anyone could wish to see. "Ho, ho," thought the boy, "is it thou who eatest up our hay in the night? But I will put a stop to that." So he took out his steel for striking fire, and threw it over the horse's mane, and the beast stood there, quiet as a lamb. Then the boy rode this horse too, away to the place where he kept the other, and then he went home again. "I suppose you will tell us that you have watched well again this time," said his brothers. "Well, so I have," said Cinderlad. So they went there again, and there was the grass, standing as high and as thick as it had the night before, but it had not make them any kinder to Cinderlad. Then the third St. John's night came. Neither of the two elder brothers dared to lie in the outlying barn to watch the grass, for they had been so heartily frightened the night that they had slept there, that they could not get over it. But Cinderlad dared to go, and everything happened just the same as the two former nights. There were three earthquakes, each worse than the other, and the last flung the boy from one wall of the barn to the other. But then everything suddenly became still as death. When he had lain quietly for a short time, he heard something chewing outside the barn door. Then once more he stole to the door, which was slightly ajar, and behold, a horse was standing just outside it, which was much larger and fatter than the other two horses he had caught. "Ho, ho! It is thou who art eating our hay all this time," thought the boy, "but I will put a stop to that." So he pulled out his seal for striking fire, and threw it over the horse, and it stood as still as if it had been nailed to the field, and the boy could do just what he liked with it. Then he mounted it, and rode away to the place where he had the other twos. Then he went home again. Then the two brothers mocked him just as they had before, and told him that they could see that he must have watched the grass very carefully that night, for he looked just as if he were walking in his sleep. But Cinderlad did not trouble himself with that, but just bade them to go to the field and see. They did go, and this time, too, the grass was standing, looking as fine and thick as ever. The king of the country in which Cinderlad's father dwelt had a daughter, whom he would give to no one who could not ride up the top of the glass hill, for there was a high hill of glass, slippery as ice, and it was close to the king's palace. Upon the very top of this the king's daughter was to sit, with 3 golden apples in her lap, and the man who could ride up and take the 3 golden apples should marry her, and have half the kingdom. They just don't make stories like these do. Upon the very top... Oh, wait. The king had then proclaimed in every church in the whole kingdom, and in many other kingdoms too. The princess was very beautiful, and all who saw her fell violently in love with her, in spite of being themselves. So it was needless to say that all the princes and knights were eager to win her. And, half the kingdom besides. But that was the cause they came riding hither and from the very end of the world, dressed so splendidly that their raiments gleamed in the sunshine, and riding on horses which seemed to dance as they went. And there was not one of these princes who did not think that he was sure to win the princess. When the day appointed that the king had come, there was such a host of knights and princes under the glass hill that they seemed to swarm, and everyone who could walk or even creep was there too, to see who won the king's daughter. Cinderlad's two brothers were there too, but they would not hear of letting him go with them, for he was so dirty and black, sleeping from the grubbing among the ashes, that they said everyone would laugh at him, and if they had seen him in company with such an oaf. "Oh, then I will go all alone, by myself," said Cinderlad. When the two brothers got to the glass hill, all the princes and knights were trying to ride up it, and their horses were in foam. But it was all in vain, for no sooner had the horses set foot upon the hill than they slipped back down, and there was not one which could even so much as a couple of yards up. Nor was that strange, for the hill was as smooth as a glass window pane, and as steep as the side of a house. But they were all eager to win the king's daughter and half the kingdom, so they rode and they slipped, and thus it went on. At length all the horses were so tired that they could do no more, and so hot that foam dropped from them, and the riders were forced to give up the attempt. Talking about the horses foaming, they're foaming at the mouth from exhaustion. The king was just thinking that he would cause it to be proclaimed that the riding should begin afresh on the following day, when perhaps it might go better. Then suddenly a knight came riding up on so fine a horse that no one had ever seen the like of it before. The knight had an armor of copper, and his bridle was copper too, and all his accoutrements were bright, so bright that they shone again. Guess who? The other knights called out to him that he might just as well spare himself the trouble of trying to ride up the glass hill, for it was no use to try. But he did not heed them, and rode straight off to it, and went up as if it were nothing at all. Thus he rode for a long way. It may have been a third part of the way up, but then when he got that far, he turned his horse around and rode back down. But the princess thought that she had never yet seen so handsome a knight, and when he was riding up, she was sitting thinking, "Oh, how I hope he may be able to come up to the top." And when she saw that he was turning his horse back, she threw one of the golden apples down at him, and it rolled onto his shoe. But when he had come down from the top of the hill, he rode away, and that so fast that no one knew what had become of him. So all the princes and knights were bidden to present themselves before the king that night, so that he who had ridden so far up the glass hill might show the golden apple which was the king's daughter had thrown down. But no one had anything to show. One knight presented himself after another, but none could show them the apple. At night, too, Cinderlad's brothers came home again, and had a long story to tell about riding up the glass hill. At first, they said that there was no one who was able to even get so much as one step up. But then a knight came who was in armor of copper, and had a bridle of copper, and his armor and trappings were so bright that they shone to a great distance, and it was something like a sight to see him riding. He rode 1/3 up the way of the glass hill, as he could easily have ridden the whole way if he had liked. But he had turned back, for he had made up his mind that that was enough for once. "Oh, I should have liked to see him, that I should," said Cinderlad, who was as usual sitting by the chimney among the cinders. "You indeed," said his brothers. "You look as if you were fit among such great lords, nasty beasts that you are, to sit there." Next day the brothers were for setting out again, and this time too Cinderlad begged them to let him go with them to see who rode. But no, they said he was not fit to do that, for he was much too ugly and dirty. "Well, well, then I will go all by myself again," said Cinderlad. So the brothers went to the glass hill, and all the princes and knights began to ride again, and this time they had taken care not to roughen up the shoes of their horses. But that did not help them. They rode and they slipped as they had done the day before, and not one of them could get even so far as a yard up the hill. When they had tired out their horses so that they could do no more, they again had to stop altogether. But just as the king, thinking that it would be well to proclaim that the riding should take place the next day for the last time, so that they might have one more chance, he suddenly bethought himself that it would be well to wait a little longer to see if the knight in copper armor would come on this day too. But nothing was seen of him. Just as they were still looking for him, however, a knight came riding up on a steed that was much, much finer than that of the knight which had the copper armor was ridden. And this knight had silver armor and a silver saddle and bridle, and all were so bright that they shone and glistened when he was a long way off. Again the other knights called to him, and said that he might as well just give up and attempt to ride up the glass hill, for it was useless to try. But the knight paid them no heed, and rode straight away to the glass hill, and went still farther up than the knight in the copper armor had gone. But when he had ridden 2/3 of the way up, he turned his horse around and rode back down. The princess liked this knight still better than she had liked the other. Princesses, really. And sat longing that he might be able to get up above. And when she saw him turning back, she threw the second apple at him, and it rolled off into his shoe. And as soon as he got down the glass hill, he rode away so fast that no one can see what had become of him. Princesses. In the evening, when everyone was to appear before the king and princess in order that he who had the golden apple might show it, one knight went in after another, but none of them had a golden apple to show. At night the two brothers went home as they had done the night before, and told how things had gone, and how everyone had ridden, but no one had been able to get up that hill. But last of all, they said, came one in silver armor, and he had a silver bridle on his horse and a silver saddle, and, oh, but he could ride. He took his horse 2/3 of the way up the hill. Then he turned back. He was a fine fellow, said the brothers, and the princess threw the second golden apple to him. "Oh, how I'd have liked to see him too," said Cinderlad. "Oh, indeed, he was a little brighter than the ashes that you are still scrubbing around in, you dirty black creature," said the brothers. On the third evening, went just as on the former days. Cinderlad wanted to go with them to look at the riding, but the two brothers would not have him in their company, and when they got to the glass hill there was no one who could ride up even so far as a yard up, and everyone waited for the knight in the silver armor. But he was neither to be seen nor heard of. At last, after a long time, came a knight riding upon a horse that was such a fine one, its equal had never yet been seen. The knight had golden armor, and the horse with a golden saddle and bridle. and these were all so bright that they shone and dazzled everyone, even while the knight was still a great distance away. The other princes and knights were not even able to call him and tell him how useless it was to ascend the hill. So amazed were they at the sight of his magnificence. He rode straight away to the glass hill and galloped up it as if there were no hill at all, so that the princess had not even time to wish that he might get to the whole way. As soon as he had ridden up to the top, he took the third golden apple from the lap of the princess, then turned his horse about and rode down again, and vanished from their sight before anyone was able to say a word to him. When the two brothers came home again that night, they had much to tell about how the riding had gone off that day, and at last they told about the knights in the golden armor, too. He was a fine fellow, that was. Such another splendid knight is not to be found on earth, said the brothers. Oh, how I should have liked to see him, too, said Cinderlad. Well, he shone nearly as brightly as the coal heaps that thou art always lying raking about, dirty black creature that you are. The next day, all the knights and princes were to appear before the king and princess. It had been too late for them to do it the night before. In order that he who had the golden apple might produce it, they all went in turn. First the princes, then knights, but none of them had the golden apple. Somebody must have it, said the king, for with our own eyes we all saw the man ride up and take it. So he commanded that everyone in the kingdom should come to the palace and see if he could show the apple. And one after the other they all came, but no one had the golden apple. And after a long, long time, Cinderlad's two brothers came likewise. They were the last of all, so the king inquired of them if there was no one else in the kingdom left to come. Oh, we have a brother, said the two, but he never got the golden apple. He never left the cinder heap on any of the 3 days. Never mind that, said the king. As everyone else has come to the palace, let him come too. So Cinderlad was forced to go to the king's palace. Hast thou the golden apple? Asked the king. Yes. Here is the first, and here's the second, and here's the third, too, said Cinderlad. He took all 3 apples out of his pocket. Big pocket. And with that he drew off the sooty rags, and appeared there before them in his brightest golden armor, which gleamed as he stood. Thou shalt have my daughter and half the kingdom, and thou hast well earned both, said the king. So there was a wedding, and Cinderlad got the king's daughter, and everyone made merry at the wedding. For all of them could make merry, though they could not ride up the glass hill. And if they have not left off their merrymaking, they're probably still going at it. Because when you gotta make merry, you gotta make merry. So the reason I called Cinderlad Ashlad is because Ashlad is typically the Norwegian version of it, where Cinderlad is more the Germanic and French version. So, there's your history for the day. Anyway. Oh god, this is going to be a hard name to say. Well, maybe not. Our next wonderful story. The story of Prince Ahmed and the Fairy Paribanou. There was a sultan who had 3 sons and a niece. The eldest of the princes was called Hussein, the second Ali, and the third Ahmed, and the princess, his niece, Naranihar. Okay. The princess Naranihar was the daughter of the younger brother of the sultan, who died, and left the princess as very young. The sultan took it upon himself to take care of his daughter's education, and brought her up in the palace with the 3 princes. proposing to marry her when she arrived at the proper age, and to contract an alliance with some neighboring prince by that means. But when he perceived that the three princes' sons loved her passionately, he thought more seriously on that affair. He was very much concerned. The difficulty he foresaw was to make them agree, and that the two youngest should consent to yield her up to their elder brother. As he found them positively obstinate teenagers, he sent them all together and said to them, "Children, since for your good and the quiet I have not been able to persuade you no longer to aspire the princess, your cousin, I think it would not be amiss if everyone traveled separately into different countries, so that you might not meet each other. And as you know, I am very curious and delight in everything that's singular. I promise my niece in marriage to him who shall bring me the most extraordinary rarity, and for the purchase of the rarity you shall go and search after the expense of traveling. I will give you everyone a sum of money." As the three princes were always submissive and obedient to the Sultan's will, and each flattered himself fortune might prove favorable to him, they all consented to it. The Sultan paid them the money he promised them, and that very day they gave orders for the preparations of their travels, and took their leave of the Sultan, that they might be more ready to go the next morning. Accordingly, they all set out from the same gate of the city, each dressed like a merchant, attended by an officer of confidence dressed like a slave, and all well mounted and equipped. They went the first day's journey together, and lay all at an inn, where the road was divided into 3 different tracts. At night, when they were at supper together, they all agreed to travel for a year, and to meet at that inn, and that the first that came should wait for the rest. That, as they all had taken their leave together of the Sultan, they might all return together. The next morning, by daybreak, after they had embraced and wished each other good success, they mounted their horses, and took each a different road. Prince Hussein, the eldest brother, arrived at Bisnagar, the capital of the kingdom of that name, and the residence of its king. He went and lodged at a khan appointed for foreign merchants, and having learned that there were 4 principal divisions where the merchants of all sorts sold their commodities and kept shops, and in the midst of which stood the castle, or rather the king's palace, he went to one of the divisions the next day. Prince Hussein could not view this division without admiration. It was large, and divided in several streets, and vaulted and shaded from the sun, and yet very light too. The shops were all of a size, and all dealt with the same sort of goods, lived in one street, and also handicraftsmen who kept their shops in the smaller streets. The multitude of shops, stocked with all sorts of merchandise, as the finest linens from several parts of India, some painted in most lively colors, and representing beasts, trees, and flowers, silks and brocades from Persia, China, and other places, porcelain both from Japan and China, and tapestries surprised him so much that he knew not how to believe his own eyes. But when he came to the goldsmiths and jewelers, he was in a kind of ecstasy to behold such prodigious quantities of wrought gold and silver, and was dazzled by the luster of the pearls, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and other jewels exposed for sale. Another thing Prince Hussein particularly admired was the great number of rose sellers who crowded the streets, for the Indians are such great lovers that they flower that no one will stir without a nosegay in the hand or a garland on his head, and the merchants kept them in pots in their shops, that the air is perfumed perfectly. After Prince Hussein had run through that division, street by street, his thoughts fully employed on the riches he had seen. He was very much tired, which a merchant perceiving civilly invited him to sit down in his shop, and he accepted, but he had not been sat down long before he saw the crier pass, with a piece of tapestry on his arm, about 6 feet square, and cried about 30 purses. The prince called to the crier and asked to see the tapestry, which seemed to him to be valued at an exorbitant price, not only for the size of it, but the meanness of the stuff, which he had examined it well. He told the crier that he could not comprehend how so small a piece of tapestry and of so indifferent appearance could be set at so high a price. The crier, who took him for a merchant, replied, "If this price seems so extravagant for you, your amazement will be greater when I tell you I have orders to raise it to 40 purses, and not to part with it under." "Certainly," answered Prince Ahmed. "It must have something very extraordinary about it, which I know nothing of." "You have guessed it, sir," replied the crier, "and will own it when you come to know that whoever sits on this piece of tapestry may be transported in an instant wherever he desires to be, without being stopped by any obstacle." Cool. At this disclosure of the crier, the Prince of the Indies considered that the principal motive of his travel was to carry the Sultan, his father, home some singular rarity. Thought that he could not meet with any which could give him more satisfaction. "If the tapestry," he said to the crier, "has the virtue you assign it, I shall think 40 purses too much. Not think 42 purses. Yeah, 40 purses too much. I shall make a present besides." "Sir," replied the crier, "I have told you the truth, and it is an easy matter to convince you of it. As soon as you have made the bargain of 40 purses, on condition I show you the experiment. But as I suppose you have not so much about you, and to perceive them I must go with you to your khan, where you lodge, with the leave of the master of the shop. Will we go to the back shop, and I will spread the tapestry, and when we have both sat down, and you have formed the wish of you to be transported into your apartment of the khan. If we are not transported thither, it shall be no bargain, and you shall be at your liberty. As to your present, though I am paid for my trouble by the seller, I shall receive it as a favor, and be much obliged to you and thankful." On the credit of the crier, the prince accepted the conditions, and concluded the bargain, and, having got the master's leave, they went to the back shop. They both sat down on it, and as soon as the prince formed his wish to be transported to an apartment at the khan, he presently found himself and the crier there, and, as wanted not a more sufficient proof of the virtue of the tapestry, he counted the crier out 40 pieces of gold, and gave him 20 pieces for himself. In this manner Prince Hussein became the possessor of the tapestry, and was overjoyed that at his arrival at Bensingar he had found so rare a piece, which he never disputed would gain him the hand of the Noranahar. In short, he looked upon it as an impossible thing for princes his young brothers to meet with anything to be compared with it. It was in his power, by sitting on this tapestry, to be at the place of meeting that very day. But as he was obliged to stay there for his brothers, as they had agreed, and he was curious to see the king of Bisnagars and his court, and to inform himself of the strength, laws, customs, and religion of the kingdom, he chose to make a longer abode there, and to spend some months in satisfying his curiosity. Prince Hassan might have made a longer abode of the kingdom and the court of Bisnagar, but he was so eager to be near the princess that, spreading the tapestry, he and the officer he had brought with him sat down, and as soon as he formed his wish were transported to the inn in which he and his brothers were to meet, and where he passed for a merchant till they came. Prince Ali, Prince Hussein's second brother, who designed to travel to Persia, took a road, having 3 days after he parted with his brothers, joined a caravan, and after 4 days' travel arrived at Shiraz, which was the capital of the kingdom of Persia. Here he passed for a jeweler. The next morning, Prince Ali, who traveled only for his pleasure, and had brought nothing but just necessities along with him, after he had dressed himself, took a walk into the part of the town which they at Shiraz called the Bezestein. Fun words. Among all criers who passed backward and forward in several sorts of goods, offering to sell them, he was not a little surprised to see one who held an ivory telescope in his hand, about a foot in length and the thickness of a man's thumb, and cried it for 30 purses. At first he thought the crier mad, and to inform himself he went to a shop and said to the merchant who stood at the door, "Pray, sir, is that not man?" pointing at the crier who cried the inventory perspective glass at 30 purses. "Mad? If he is not, I am very much deceived." "Indeed, sir," answered the merchant, "he was in his right senses yesterday. I can assure you that he is one of the ablest criers we have, and the most employed of anything valuable is to be sold. If he cries the ivory perspective glass at 30 purses, it must be worth as that, if not much more, or on some other account or another. He will come by presently, and we will call him, and you shall be satisfied. In the meantime, sit down on my sofa and rest yourself." Hey, Clover. Prince Ali accepted the merchant's obliging offer, and presently afterward the crier passed by. The merchant called him by his name, and, pointing to the prince, said to him, "Tell that gentleman who asked me if you were in your right senses what you mean by crying that ivory perspective glass, which seems not to be worth much, at 30 purses. I should very much be amazed myself if I did not know you." The crier addressed himself to Prince Ali and said, "Sir, you are not the only person that takes me as a madman on account of this perspective glass. You shall judge yourself whether I am or no, when I have told you its property, and I hope you will value it as high a price as those I have shown it to already, who had as bad an opinion of me as you." "Yes, first, sir," pursued the crier, presenting the ivory pipe to the prince, "observe that this pipe is furnished with glass at both ends, and consider that you are looking through one of them you see whatever object you wish to behold." "I am," said the prince, "ready to make you all imaginable preparation for the scandal I have thrown on you if you make the truth of what you advance appear." And as he held the ivory pipe in his hand, after he had looked at the 2 glasses, he said, "Show me which end the points I must look at, that I might be satisfied." The crier presently showed him, and looked through, wishing at the same time to see the Sultan his father, whom he immediately beheld in perfect health, set on his throne in the midst of his council. Afterward there was nothing in the world so dear to him, after the Sultan, as the Princess Nouronihar. He wished to see her, and saw her at her toilet laughing, and in pleasant humour with her women about her. Not that kind of toilet. Prince Ali wanted no other proof to be persuaded that this perspective glass was the most valuable thing in the world, and believed that if he should neglect to purchase it, he should never meet again with such another rarity. He therefore took the crier with him to the khan where he lodged, and counted him out the money, and received the perspective glass. Prince Ali was overjoyed at his bargain, and persuaded himself that, as his brothers would not be able to meet with anything so rare and admirable, the Princess Nouronihar would be the recompense of his fatigue and trouble, that he thought of nothing but visiting the court of Persia incognito, and seeing whatever was curious in Shiraz and thereabouts, till the caravan with which he came returned back to the Indies. As soon as the caravan was ready to set out, the prince joined them, and arrived happily without any incident or trouble, otherwise than the length of the journey and the fatigue of travelling, at the place of rendezvous, where he found Prince Hussein, and both waited for Prince Ahmed. Prince Ahmed, who took the road to Samarkand, the next day after his arrival, there went, and his brothers had done, into the Byzantine, where he had not walked long, but heard a crier, who had an artificial apple in his hand, cried at 5 purses. Upon which he stopped the crier, and said to him, "Let me see that apple, and tell me what virtue and extraordinary properties it has, to be valued at so high a rate." "Sir," said the crier, giving it to his hand, "if you look at the outside of this apple, it is very worthless. But if you consider its properties, virtues, and the great use and benefit it has to mankind, you will say it is no price for it, and that he who possesses it is master of a great treasure. In short, it cures all sick persons of the most mortal diseases, and if the patient is dying, it will recover him immediately and restore him to perfect health. This is done after the easiest manner in the world, which is by the patient's smelling of the apple." That apple a day, I guess. "If I may believe you," replied Prince Ahmed, "the virtues of this apple are wonderful, and if it is invaluable, but what ground have I, for all you tell me, to be persuaded of the truth in this matter?" "Sir," replied the crier, "the thing is known and averred by the whole city of Samarkand, and without going any further, ask all these merchants you see here, and hear what they say. You will find several of them will tell you they had not been alive this day if it had not been made use for this excellent remedy. And that you may better comprehend what it is, I must tell you that it is the fruit of the study and experiments of a celebrated philosopher of the city, who applied himself all his lifetime in study and knowledge of the virtues of plants and minerals, and at last attained this composition, by which he performed such surprising cures in this town as will never be forgot, but died suddenly himself before he could apply this sovereign remedy, and left his wife and a great many young children behind him, in very indifferent circumstances, whom, to support their family and provide for her children, is resolved to sell it." While the crier informed Prince Ahmed of the virtues of the artificial apple, a great many persons came about them and confirmed what he said, and one among the rest said he had a friend dangerously ill whose life was despaired of, and that a favourable opportunity to show Prince Ahmed the experiment. Upon which Prince Ahmed told the crier he would give him 40 purses if he cured the sick person. The crier, who had orders to sell it at that price, said to Prince Ahmed, "Come, sir, let us go and make the experiment, and the apple shall be yours, and I can assure you that it will always have the desired effect." In short, the experiment succeeded, and the prince, after he had counted out to the crier 40 purses, and he had delivered the apple to him, waited patiently for the first caravan that should return to the Indies, and arrived in perfect health at the inn the Princes Hussein and Ali waited for him. When the princes met, they showed each other their treasures, and immediately saw through the glass that the princess was dying. Then they sat down on the carpet and wished themselves to her, and were there in a moment. Prince Ahmed no sooner perceived himself that now were in Nahar's chamber than he rose off the tapestry, as did the other two princes, and went to the bedside, and put the apple under her nose. Some moments after, the princess opened her eyes and turned her head from one side to another, looking at the persons who stood about her, then rose up in the bed and asked to be dressed, just as she had wakened from her sound sleep. Her women having presently informed her, in a manner that showed her joy, that she was obliged to the three princes for her sudden recovery of her health, and particularly to Prince Ahmed, she immediately expressed her joy to see them, and thanked them all together, and afterward Prince Ahmed in particular. When the princess was dressing, princes went to throw themselves at the Sultan, their father's feet, and pay their respects to him. But when they came before him, they found he had been informed of their arrival by the chief of the princess's eunuchs, and by what means the princess had been perfectly cured. The Sultan received and embraced them with his greatest joy, both for their return and the recovery of the princess, his niece, whom he loved as well as if she had been his own daughter, and whom had been given over by the physicians. After the usual ceremonies and compliments, the princes presented each his rarity. Prince Hussein the tapestry, which he had taken care of not to leave behind in the princess's chamber, Prince Ali his ivory perspective glass, and Prince Ahmed his artificial apple, and after each had commended their present, when they had put it in the Sultan's hands, he begged of them to pronounce their fate, and declare to which of them he would give the Princess Naranjahar for wife, according to his promise. The Sultan of the Indies having heard, without interrupting them, all the princes could represent further about their rarities, and being well informed of what had happened in relation to Princess Naranjar's cure, remained some time silent, as if he were thinking on what answer he should make. At last he broke the silence and said to them, "I would declare for one of you children with a great pleasure if I could do it with justice. But consider whether I can do it or no. 'Tis true, Prince Ahmed, the princess, my niece, is obliged to your artificial apple for her cure. But I must ask you whether or not you could have been so serviceable to her if you had not known by Prince Ali's perspective glass the danger she was in, and if Prince Hussein's tapestry had not brought you so soon. Your perspective glass, Prince Ali, informed you and your brothers that you were like to lose the princess your cousin, and there you must own an obligation. You must also grant that the knowledge would have been of no service without the artificial apple and the tapestry. And lastly, Prince Hussein, the princess would be very ungrateful if she did not show her acknowledgment of the service of your tapestry, which was so necessary a means towards her cure. But consider, it would have been of little use to you if you had not acquainted with the princess's illnesses by Prince Ali's glass, and by Prince Ahmed had not applied his artificial apple. Therefore, as neither the tapestry, ivory perspective glass, nor artificial apple have least preference, one before the other, but, on the contrary, there is a perfect equality, I cannot grant the princess to any one of you, and the only fruit you have reaped from your travels is the glory of having equally contributed to restore her health. If all this be true, added the Sultan, you see that I must have recourse to no other means to determine certainty of the choice I ought to have made among you, and that, as there is time enough between this and night, I'll do it today. Go, and each of you a bow and arrow, and repair to the great plain, where they exercise horses. I'll soon come to you, and declare I will give the Princess Naranjahar to him that shoots the farthest." The three princes had nothing to say against the decision of the Sultan. When they were out of their presence, they each provided themselves with a bow and arrow, which they delivered to one of their officers, and went to the plain appointed, and followed by a great concourse of people. The Sultan did not make them wait long for him, and as soon as he arrived, Prince Hussein, as the eldest, took his bow and shot the arrow first. Prince Ali shot next, and much beyond him, and Prince Ahmed last of all, but it so happened that nobody could see where his arrow fell, and notwithstanding all the diligence that he was used to himself and everybody else, it was not to be found near or far. And though it was believed that he shot the furthest, and that he therefore deserved Princess Naranahar, it was, however, necessary that his arrow should be found to make the matter more evident and certain. And, notwithstanding his remonstrance, the Sultan judged in favor of Prince Ali, and gave orders for preparations to be made for the wedding, which was celebrated a few days after with great magnificence. Prince Hussein would not honor the feast with his presence. In short, his grief was so violent and insupportable that he left the court and renounced all right of succession to the crown to turn a hermit. Prince Ahmed, too, did not come to Prince Ali's and the princess's wedding, any more than his brother Hussein, but did not renounce the world as he had done. But, as he could not imagine what had become of his arrow, he stole away from his attendants and resolved to search after it, that he might not anything to approach himself with. With the intent, he went to the place where the Princess Hussein's and Ali's were gathered up, and going straight forward from there, looking carefully on both sides of him, he went so far that at last he began to think his labor was in vain. But yet he could not help going forward till he came to some steep, craggy rocks, which were bounds to his journey, and were situated in a barren country about 4 leagues distant from where he set out. And he's taking a long walk. Oh, it's a second. Part 2. When Prince Ahmed came pretty nigh to these rocks, he perceived an arrow, which he gathered up, looked earnestly at it, and was in the greatest astonishment to find that it was the same arrow he shot away. Certainly, he said to himself, neither I nor any man living could shoot an arrow so far. And finding it laid flat, not sticking into the ground, he judged that it had rebounded against the rock. There must be some mystery to this, as he said it again, and it may be advantageous to me, perhaps fortune, to make me amends for depriving me of what I thought was the greatest happiness, may be reserved a greater blessing for my comfort. All of these rocks were full of caves, and some of these caves were deep. The prince entered into one, and looking about, cast his eyes on an iron door, which seemed to have no lock, but he feared it was fastened. However, thrusting against it, it opened, and discovered an easy descent, but no steps, which he walked down with the arrow in his hand. At first he thought he was going into a dark, obscure place, but presently a quite different light succeeded that which he came out of, and entering into a large, spacious place, about 50 or 60 paces distant, he perceived a magnificent palace, which he had not then time enough to look at. At the same time, a lady of majestic port and air advanced far from the porch, attended by a large troop of ladies, so finely dressed and beautiful that it was difficult to distinguish which was the mistress. As soon as Prince Ahmed perceived the lady, he made all the imaginable haste to go and pay his respects, and the lady, on her part, seeing him coming, prevented him from addressing his disclosure to her first, but said to him, "Come near, Prince Ahmed, you are welcome." It was no small surprise to the prince to hear himself named in a place that he had never heard of, though so nigh to his father's capital, and he could not comprehend how he should be known to a lady who was a stranger to him. At last he returned the lady's compliment by throwing himself at her feet, and rising up again, he said to her, "Madam, I return you 1,000 thanks for the assurance you give me for a welcome to the place, which I believed my most impudent curiosity had made me penetrate too far. But, madam, may I, without being guilty of ill manners, dare to ask you by what adventure you know me, and how you, who live in the same neighborhood with me, should be so great a stranger to me?" "Prince," said the lady, "let us go into the hall. There I will gratify you and your request." After these words, the lady led Prince Ahmed into the hall. Then she sat down on a sofa, and when the prince by her entreaty, had done so the same, she said, "You are surprised, you say, that I should know and not be known by you. But you will be no longer surprised when I inform you who I am. You are undoubtedly sensible that your religion teaches you to believe that the world is inhabited by genies as well as men. I am the daughter of one of the most powerful and distinguished genies, and my name is Paribanou. The only thing that I have to add is that you seem worthy of a more happy fate than that of possessing the Princess Noranahar, that you might attain to. I was present when you drew your arrow, and foresaw it would not go beyond Princess Haines. I took it in the air and gave it the necessity motion to strike against the rocks near which you found it. And I tell you that it lies in your power to make use of the favorable opportunity which presents itself to make you happy." As Princess Paribanou pronounced these last words with a different tone, and looked at the same time tenderly upon Prince Ahmed, with a modest blush on her cheeks, it was no hard matter for the prince to comprehend what happiness she meant. He presently considered that the Princess Noranahar would never be his, and that the Fairy Paribanou excelled her beauty infinitely, with agreeable wit, and, as much as could be conjectured by the magnificence of the palace, in immense riches. He blessed the moment that he thought of seeking after his arrow a second time, and, yielding to his love, "Madam," replied he, "should I all my life have the happiness of being your slave, and the admirer of many charms which ravish my soul, I should think myself the most blessed of men. Pardon in me the boldness which inspires me to ask this favor, and don't refuse to admit me into your court, a prince who is entirely devoted to you." "Prince," answered the fairy, "will you not pledge your faith to me, as well as I give mine to you?" "Yes, madam," replied the prince, in an ecstasy of joy. "What can I do better, and with greater pleasure? Yes, my sultaness, my queen, I'll give you my heart without the least reserve." "Then," answered the fairy, "you are my husband, and I am your wife. But, as I suppose," pursued she, "that you have eaten nothing today, a slight repast shall be served up for you, while preparations are making for our wedding feast at night, and then I shall show you the apartments of my palace, and you shall judge if this hall is not the meanest part of it." Some of the fairy's women, who came into the hall with them, and guessed her intentions, went immediately out, and returned presently with some excellent meats and wines. When Prince Ahmed had ate and drunk as much as he cared for, the fairy Paribanou carried him through the apartments, where he saw diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, and all sorts of fine jewels intermixed with pearls, agates, jasper, porphyries, and all sorts of precious marbles, but not to mention the richness of the furniture, which is unestimable. There was such a profuseness throughout that the prince, instead of ever having seen anything like it, owned that he could not have imagined that there was anything in the world that could come up to it. "Prince," said the fairy, "if you admire my palace so much, which, indeed, it is very beautiful, what would you say to the palaces of the chief of our genies, which are much more beautiful, spacious, and magnificent? I can only charm you with my gardens, but we will let that alone till another time. Night draws near, and it will be time to go to supper." The next hall which the fairy led the prince into, and where the cloth was laid for the feast, was the last apartment the prince had not seen, and not in the least inferior to the others. At his entrance into it he admired the infinite numbers of sconces of wax candles, perfumed with amber, and multitude of which, instead of being confused, were placed with so just a symmetry has formed an agreeable and pleasant sight. A large side table was set out with all sorts of gold plate, so finely wrought that the workmanship was much more valuable than the weight of the gold. Several choruses of beautiful women, richly dressed, and whose voices were ravishing, began a concert, accompanied with all sorts of the most harmonious instruments, and when they were set down at the table, the Fairy Paribanou took care of the Prince Ahmed to the most delicate meats, and which she named as she invited him to eat them, and which the prince found to be so exquisitely nice that he commended them with exaggeration, and said that the entertainment far surpassed those of man. He found also the same excellence in the wines, which neither he nor the fairy tasted till the dessert was served up, which consisted of the choicest sweetmeats and fruits. This is making me hungry. The wedding feast was continued the next day, or rather, the days following the celebration were a continual feast. At the end of 6 months, Prince Ahmed, who always loved and honored the Sultan his father, conceived a great desire to know how he was, and that desire could not be satisfied without going to see. He told the fairy of it, and desired she would give him leave. "Prince," said she, "go when you please, but first don't take it amiss that I give you some advice how you shall behave yourself where you are going. First, I don't think it proper for you to tell the Sultan your father of our marriage, nor of my quality, nor of the palace which you have been in. Beg of him to be satisfied in knowing you are happy, and desire no more. And let him know that the sole end of your visit is to make him easy and inform him of your fate." She appointed 20 gentlemen, well mounted and equipped, to attend him. When all was ready, Prince Ahmed took his leave of the fairy, embraced her, and renewed his promise to return soon. Then his horse, which was the most finely caparisoned, and was as beautiful a creature as any of the Sultan's stables, was led to him, and he mounted him with the extraordinary grace, and after he had bid her a last adieu, set forward on his journey. As it was not a great way to his father's capital, Prince Ahmed soon arrived there. People, glad to see him again, received him with acclamations of joy, and followed him in crowds to the Sultan's apartment. The Sultan received and embraced him with great joy, complaining at the same time, with a fatherly tenderness, of the affection his long absence had been to him, which, he said, was more grievous for that, fortune having been decided in favor of Prince Ali his brother, he was afraid he might have committed some rash action. The prince told a story of his adventures without speaking of the fairy, whom he said that he must not mention, and ended, "The only favor I ask of your majesty is to give me leave to come often and pay you my respects, and to know how you do." "Son," answered the Sultan of the Indies, "I cannot refuse you to ask you leave of me, but I should rather you would resolve to stay with me. At least tell me where I may send to you if you should fail to come, or when I think your perspective necessary." "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "what your majesty asks of me is part of the mystery I spoke of to your majesty. I beg of you to give me leave to remain silent on my head, for I shall come so frequently that I am afraid that I shall sooner be thought troublesome than to be accused of negligence of your duty." The Sultan of the Indies pressed Prince Ahmed no more, but said to him, "Son, I penetrate no farther into your secrets, but leave you at your liberty. But can you tell that you could not do me a greater pleasure than to come, and by your presence restore to me the joy I have
Who are
not
you?
felt this
How
long
did you
time,
find me?
and that you shall always be welcome when you come, without interrupting your business or pleasure?" Prince Ahmed stayed but 3 days at the Sultan his father's court, and the fourth returned to Fairy Paribanou, who did not expect him home so soon. A month after Prince Ahmed's return from paying a visit to his father, as the Fairy Paribanou had observed to the prince, since that time he gave her an account of his journey, his discourse with his father, and the leave he asked to go and see him often, had never talked to the Sultan, as if there had been no such person in the world, whereas before he was always speaking of him. She thought he forbore on her account. Therefore she took an opportunity to say to him, "Prince, tell me, have you forgot the Sultan your father? Don't you remember the promise you made to go and see him often? For my part, I have not forgot what you told me at your return, and so put you in mind of it, that you may not be long before you acquit yourself of your promise." Maybe. So Prince Ahmed went to the next morning with the same attendants as before, but much finer, and himself more magnificently mounted, equipped, and dressed, and was received by the Sultan with the same joy and satisfaction. For several months he constantly paid his visits, always in a richer and more finer equipage. At last some viziers, the Sultan's favourites, who judged of Prince Ahmed's grandeur and power by the figure of his cut. He, the Sultan, was jealous of his son, saying that it was to be feared he might inveigle himself in the people's favour and dethrone him. The Sultan of the Indies was so far from thinking that Prince Ahmed could be capable of such a pernicious design as his favourites would make him believe, that he said to them, "You are mistaken. My son loves me, and I am certain of his tenderness and fidelity, as I have given him no reason to be disgusted." But the favourites went on abusing Prince Ahmed till the Sultan said, "Be it as it will, I don't believe my son Ahmed is so wicked as you would persuade me that he is. However, I am obliged to you for your good advice, and don't dispute but that it proceeds from your good intentions." The Sultan of the Indies said that his favourites might not know the impressions their discourse had made on his mind, which had so alarmed him that he resolved to have Prince Ahmed watched unknown to his Grand Vizier. So he went for a female magician, who was introduced by a back door to his apartment. That just sounds bad. "Go immediately," he said, "and follow my son, and watch him so well as to find out where he retires, and bring me word." The magician left the Sultan, and, knowing the place where Prince Ahmed found his arrow, went immediately thither, and hid herself near the rocks so that nobody could see her. The next morning Prince Ahmed set out at daybreak, without taking leave either of the Sultan or any of his court, according to the custom. The magician, having seen him coming, followed him with her eyes, till on the sudden she lost sight of him and his attendants. As the rocks were very steep and craggy, they were insurmountable barriers, so that the magician judged that they were but two things for it. Either the prince retired into some cavern, or abode of genies and fairies. Therefore she came out of the place where she hid, and went directly to follow, which she traced until she came at the farther end, looking carefully about on all sides, but, notwithstanding all her diligence, could perceive no opening, not so much as the iron gate which Prince Ahmed discovered, which was to be seen and opened by none but men, and only to such whose presence was agreeable to the Fairy Paribanou. The magician, who saw it was in vain for her to search any farther, was obliged to be satisfied with the discovery she had made, and returned to the Sultan on account. The Sultan was very pleased with the magician's conduct, and said to her, "Do as you think fit. I'll wait patiently the event of your promises." And to encourage her, he made her a present of a diamond of great value. As Prince Ahmed had obtained the Fairy Paribou's leave to go to the Sultan's Indies court once a month, he never failed, and the magician, knowing the time, went a day or two before the foot of the rock, where she lost sight of the prince and his attendants, and waited there. The next morning Prince Ahmed went out, as usual, at the iron gate, with some attendants as before, and passed by the magician, whom he knew not to be such, and, seeing her lie with her head against the rock, and complaining as if she were in great pain, he pitied her, turned his horse about, and went to her, and asked her what was the matter with her, and what he could do to help her. The artful sorceress looked at the prince in a pitiful manner, without ever lifting up her head, and answered in broken words and sighs, as if she could not hardly fetch her breath, and that she was going to the capital city, but on her way thither she was taken with so violent a fever that her strength failed her, and she was forced to lie down where he saw her, far from any habitation, and without any hopes of assistance. "Good woman," replied the prince, "you are not so far from help as you can imagine. I am ready to assist you and convey you where you will meet with a speedy cure. Only get up and let one of my people take you behind them." At these words, the magician, who pretended sickness only to know where the prince had lived and what he did, refused not the charitable offer he made her, but that her actions might correspond with her words, she made many pretended vain endeavors to get up. At the same time, two of the prince's attendants, alighting off their horses, helped her up and set her behind another, and mounted their horses again, and followed the prince, who turned back to the iron gate, which was opened by one of his retainers who rode before. And when he came into the outward court of the fairy, without dismounting himself, he sensed to her that he wanted to speak with her. The Fairy Paribanou came with all imaginable haste, not knowing what made Prince Ahmed return so soon, who, not giving her time to ask the reason, said, "Princess, I desire you would have compassion on this good woman," pointing to the magician, who was held up by two of his retinue. "I found her in the condition you see her in, and promised her the assistance she stands in need of, and am persuaded that you, out of your own goodness, as well as upon the entreaty, will not abandon her." The Fairy Paribanou, who had eyes fixed upon the pretend sick woman all the time that the prince was talking to her, understood two of her women who followed her to take her from the two men who held her, and carry her into an apartment of the palace, and take as much care of her as she would herself. While the two women executed the fairy's commands, she went up to Prince Ahmed and whispered in his ear, "Prince, this woman is not sick as she pretends to be, and I am very much mistaken if she is not an impostor, who will be the cause of great trouble to you. But don't be concerned. Let what will be devised against you be persuaded that I will deliver you out of all snares that she will be laid for you. Go and pursue your journey." This discourse of the fairy did not in the least frighten Prince Ahmed. "My princess," he said, "as I do not remember I ever or designed anybody to injury, I cannot believe anybody could have thought of doing one me. But if they have, I shall not, nevertheless, forbear doing good whenever I have the opportunity." Then he went back to his father's palace. In the meantime, the two women carried the magician into a very fine apartment, richly furnished. There they sat her down upon a sofa, and with her back supported with a cushion of gold brocade, while they made a bed of the same sofa before her, the quilt of which was finely embroidered in silk, the sheets of the finest linen, and the coverlet cloth of gold. When they had put her into bed, for the old sorceress pretended that her fever was so violent she could not help herself in the least, one of the women went out, and returned soon again with a china dish in her hand, full of a certain liqueur. which she presented to the magician, while the other helped her to sit up. "Drink this liqueur," she said. "It is the water of the Fountain of Lions, and a sovereign remedy against all fevers whatsoever. You will find the effect of it in less than an hour's time." The magician, to disassemble the better, took it after a great deal of entreaty. But at last she took the china dish, and, holding back her head, swallowed down the liqueur. When she was laid down against the two women, covered her up. "Lie quiet," said she who brought her up the china cup, "and let the little sleep if you can. We'll leave you, and hope to find you perfectly cured when we again come our ends." The two women came again at the time they said they would, and found the magician up and dressed, and sitting on the sofa. "Oh, admirable potion," she said. "It has wrought its cure much sooner than you told me it would, and I shall be able to prosecute my journey." The two women, who were fairies as well as their mistress, after they had told the magician how glad they were that she was cured so soon, walked before her and conducted her through several apartments, all more noble than that wherein she lay, into a large hall, the most richly and magnificently furnished of all the palace. Paribanou sat in this hall on a throne of massive gold, enriched with diamonds, rubies, pearls, of extraordinary size, and attended on each hand by a great number of beautiful fairies, all richly clothed. At the sight of such majesty the magician was not only dazzled, but was so amazed that, after she prostrated herself before the throne, she could not open her lips to thank the fairy as she proposed. However, Paribanou saved her the trouble, and said to her, "Good woman, I am glad I had the opportunity to oblige you, and to see you are able to pursue your journey. I won't detain you, but perhaps you may not be so displeased to see my palace. Follow my women, and they will show it to you." Then the magician went back and related to the Sultan of the Indies all that had happened, and how very rich Prince Ahmed was since his marriage to the fairy, richer than all the kings in the world, and how there was a danger that he should come and take the throne from his father. Honestly, why would he want it? Though the Sultan of the Indies was very well persuaded that Prince Ahmed's natural disposition was good, yet he could not help being concerned at the disclosure of the old sorceress, to whom, when she was taking her leave, he said, "I thank thee for the pains thou hast taken, and thy wholesome advice. I am so sensible of the great importance it is to me that I shall deliberate upon it in council." Now the favorites advised the prince should be killed, but the magician advised differently. "Make him give you all the wonderful things, by the fairy's help, till she tires of him and sends him away. As, for example, every time your majesty goes into a field, you are obliged to be at such great expense, not only in pavilions and tents of your army, but likewise in mules and camels to carry their luggage. Now, might you not engage him to use his interest with the fairy to procure you a tent which might be carried in a man's hand, and which should be so large as to shelter your whole army against bad weather?" It's a hell of a tent. When the magician had finished her speech, the Sultan asked his favorites if they had anything better to propose, and finding them all silent, determined to follow the magician's advice, as the most reasonable and most agreeable to his mild government. The next day the Sultan did as the magician had advised him, and asked for the pavilion. Prince Ahmed never expected that the Sultan, his father, would have asked for such a thing, which at first he appeared so difficult, not to say impossible. Though he knew not absolutely how great the powers of the genie and fairies was, he doubted whether he extended so far as to compass such a tent as his father desired. At last he replied, Though it is with greatest reluctance imaginable, I will not fail to ask the favor of my wife your majesty desires, but will not promise you to obtain it, and if I should not have the honor to come again to pay you my respects, that shall be the sign that I have not had success. But beforehand, I desire you to forgive me, and consider that you yourself have reduced me to this extremity. Son, replied the Sultan of the Indies, I should be very sorry if what I ask of you caused me the displeasure of never seeing you more. I find you don't know the power a husband has over a wife. And yours would show that her love to you was very indifferent if she, with the power she has of a fairy, should refuse you so trifling a request as this I desire to ask of you for her of my sake. The prince went back, and was very sad for fear of offending the fairy. She kept pressing him to tell her what was the matter, and at last he said, Madam, you may have observed that hitherto I have been content with your love, and have never asked you any other favor. Consider, then, I conjure you, that it is not I, but the Sultan my father, who, indiscreetly, or at least I think so, begs of you a pavilion large enough to shelter him, his court, and army from the violence of the weather, and which a man may carry in his hand. But remember, it is the Sultan my father who asks for this favor. Prince, replied the fairy, smiling, I am sorry that so small a matter should disturb you, and make you so uneasy as you appear to me. Then the fairy sent her treasurer, to whom, she came, she said, Nouragaham, which was her name, bring me the largest pavilion in my treasury. Nouragaham presently returned with the pavilion, which she could not only hold in her hand, but in the palm of her hand, when she shut her fingers, and presented it to her mistress, who gave it to Prince Ahmed to look at. When Prince Ahmed saw the pavilion which the fairy called the largest in her treasury, he fancied she had a mind to jest with him, and thereupon the marks of his surprise appeared presently in his countenance, which Paribanou perceived and burst out laughing. What, Prince, she said, do you think I jest with you? You will see presently that I am in earnest. Nouragaham, she said to her treasurer, taking the tent out of the Prince Ahmed's hands, go and set it up, so that the prince may judge whether it may be large enough for the Sultan his father. The treasurer went immediately out of the palace, and carried it a great way off. And when she had set up one end, she reached the very palace, at which time the prince, thinking it small, found it large enough to shelter two greater armies than that of the Sultan his father's, and then said Paribanou, ask my princess 1,000 pardons for my incredulity. After what I have seen, I believe there is nothing impossible of you. You see, said the fairy, that the pavilion is larger than what your father may have occasion for you must know that it was one property, that it was larger or smaller according to the army it covered. Nice. The treasurer took down the tent again, and brought it to the prince, who took it, and, without saying any longer, till then the next day, mounted his horse, and went with the same attendants to his father, the Sultan. The Sultan, who was persuaded that there could be not anything as much as a tent that he asked for, was in great surprise at the prince's diligence. He took the tent, and after he admired its smallness, his amazement was so great that he could not recover himself. When the tent was set up in the great plain, which he have before mentioned, he found it large enough to shelter an army twice as large as he could bring into the field. But the Sultan was not yet satisfied. Son, he said, I have already expressed to you how much I am obliged to you for the present of the tent you have procured me, that I look upon it the most valuable thing in all my treasury. But you must do one more thing for me, which will be every whit as agreeable to me. I am informed that the fairy, your spouse, makes use of a certain water, called the water of the Fountain of Lions, which cures all sorts of fevers, even the most dangerous, and as I am perfectly well persuaded, my health is dear to you. I don't doubt but you will ask her for a bottle of that water for me, and bring it to me as a sovereign medicine, which I may make use of when I go occasion. Do this for me this piece of service, and therefore complete the duty of a good son towards a tender father. Jeez, bossy dad. The prince returned and told the fairy what his father had said. There's a great deal of wickedness in this demand, she answered, as you will understand by what I am going to tell you. The Fountain of Lions is situated in the middle of the court of the great castle, the entrance of which is guarded by 4 fierce lions, 2 of which sleep alternately, while the other 2 are awake. But don't let that frighten you. I'll give you the means to pass them without any danger. The Fairy Paribanou was at that time very hard at work, and as she had several clues of thread by her, she took one up, and presenting it to Prince Ahmed, said, "First take this clue of thread. I'll tell you presently its use of it. In the second place, you must have 2 horses. One you must ride yourself, and the other you must lead, which must be loaded with a sheep cut into 4 quarters. That must be killed today. In the third place, you must be provided with a bottle, which I will give you to bring the water in. Set out early tomorrow morning, and when you have passed the iron gate, throw the clue of thread before you, which will roll until it comes to the gates of the castle. Follow it, and when it stops, the gates will open. You will see the 4 lions. The 2 that are awake still, by their roaring, wake the other 2. But don't be frightened, but throw each of them a quarter of mutton, and then clap spurs to your horse and ride to the fountain, fill your bottle without lighting, and then return with the same expedition. The lions will be so busy eating that they will let you pass by them." Prince Ahmed set out the next morning, at the time appointed by the fairy, and followed her directions exactly. When he arrived at the gates of the castle, he distributed the quarters of mutton among the 4 lions, and passing through the midst of them, bravely got to the fountain, filled his bottle, and returned back as safe and sound as he went. When he had gone a little distance from the castle gates, he turned about, and perceiving 2 of the lions coming after him, he drew his saber and himself for defense. But as he went forward to draw, saw one of them turned out of the road at some distance, and showed by his head and tail that it did not come to him by any harm, but only to go before him, and that the other stayed behind to follow. He put his sword up again by its scabbard. Guarded in this manner, he came to the capital of the Indies, but the lions never left him at all till they conducted him to the gates of the Sultan's palace, after which they returned the same way they came, though not without frightening all that saw them, for all they went in a very gentle manner, and showed no fierceness. A great many officers came to attend the prince while he dismounted his horse, and afterward conducted him into the Sultan's apartment, who was at the time surrounded with his favorites. He approached toward the throne, laid the bottle at the Sultan's feet, and kissed the rich tapestry which covered his footstool, and then said, "I have brought you, sir, the healthful water which your majesty desired so much to keep among your other rarities in your treasury, but at the same time wish you such extraordinary health as never to have the occasion to make use of it." After the prince had made an end to his compliment to the Sultan, placed him on his right hand, and then said to him, "Son, I am very obliged to you for this valuable present, and also for the great danger you have exposed yourself to upon my account, which I have been informed by the magician who knows of the Fountain of Lions. But do me the pleasure," continued he, "to inform me by what address, or rather by what incredible power, you have been secured." "Sir," replied the Prince Ahmed, I have no share of the compliments your majesty is pleased to make me. All the honor is due to the fairy, my spouse, whose good advice I followed. Then he informed the Sultan what those directions were, and by the relation to his expedition let him know how well he had behaved himself. When he had done, the Sultan, who showed outwardly all the demonstrations of great joy, but secretly became more jealous, retired to an inward apartment, where he sent for the magician. The magician, at her arrival, saved the Sultan the trouble to tell her of the success of Prince Ahmed's journey, which he had heard of before she came, and therefore was prepared with an infallible means, as she pretended. This means she communicated to the Sultan, who declared it the next day to the prince in the midst of all his couriers, in the words, "Son," he said, "I have one more thing to ask of you, after which I shall expect nothing more of your obedience, nor of your interest with your wife. This request is, to bring me a man not above 1.5 feet high, and whose beard is 30 feet long, who carries a bar of iron upon his shoulders, of 500 weight, which he uses as a quarterstaff." Prince Ahmed, who did not believe that there was such a man in the world as his father described, good cause, would gladly have excused himself, but the Sultan persisted in his demand and told him the fairy could do more incredible things. In-laws. The next day the prince returned to his dear Paribanou, to whom he told his father's new demand, which, he said, he looked upon to be the thing more impossible than the first two. "For," added he, "I cannot imagine there be such a man in the world. Without doubt, he has his mind to whether or no I am silly as to go about it, or he has a design on my ruin. In short, how can he suppose that I should lay hold of a man so well armed, though he is but little? What arms can I make use of to reduce to my will? If there are any means, I beg you will tell them, and let me come off with honor this time." "Don't fret yourself, Prince," replied the fairy. "You ran a risk of fetching the water of the fountain of lands for your father, but there is no danger in finding out this man, who is my brother, Shaibar. But it is far from being like me, though we both have the same father, that he is such of a violent nature that nothing can prevent him giving his cruel marks of his resentment for the sight of offence. Yet, on the other hand, it is good to oblige anyone who, whatever they desire. He is made exactly as the Sultan your father has described him, and has no other arms than the bar of iron, 500 pounds weight, without which he never stirs, and make him respected. I'll send for him, and you shall judge the truth of what I tell you. But be sure to prepare yourself against being frightened at his extraordinary figure when you see him." "What, my queen?" replied Prince Ahmed. "Do you say Shaibar is your brother? Let him never be so ugly or deformed I shall be so far from being frightened at the sight of him. As our brother, I shall honor and love him." Good man. The fairy ordered a gold chafing dish to be set with a fire under the porch of the palace, with a box of the same metal which is a present to her, out of which, taking the perfume and throwing it into the fire, there rose a thick cloud of smoke. Some moments after, the fairy said to Prince Ahmed, "See, here comes my brother." The prince immediately perceived Shaibar coming gravely with his heavy bar on his shoulder, his long beard, which he held up before him, and a pair of thick mustachios, which he tucked behind his ears and almost covered his face. His eyes were very small and deep-set, in his head, which was far from being the smallest size, and on his head he wore a grenadier's cap. Besides all this, he was very much humpbacked. If Prince Ahmed had not known that Shaibar was Paribanou's brother, he would have not been able to have looked at him without fear. But, knowing first who he was, he stood by the fairy without the least concern. Shaibar, as he came forward, looked at the prince earnestly enough to have chilled his blood in his veins, and asked Paribanou, when he first accosted her, who that man was. To which she replied, "He is my husband, brother. His name is Ahmed. He is the son of the Sultan of the Indies. The reason why I did not invite you to my wedding was I was unwilling to divert you from an expedition you are engaged in, and from which I heard the pleasure would return victorious, and so took the liberty now to call for you." At these words, Shabar looked at the Prince Ahmed favorably, and said, "Is there anything, sister, where I can serve him? It is enough for me that he is your husband to engage me to do for him whatever he desires." "The Sultan, his father," replied Paribanou, "has a curiosity in you, and I desire he may be your guide to the Sultan's court. You need but lead me the way, and I'll follow him." "Brother," said Paribanou, "it is too late to go today, therefore stay till tomorrow morning, and in the meantime I will inform you of all that has passed between the Sultan of the Indies and Prince Ahmed since our marriage." The next morning, after Shaibar had been informed of the affair, he and Prince Ahmed set out to the Sultan's court. When they arrived at the gates of the capital, the people no sooner saw Shaibar but they ran and hid themselves, and some shut up their shops and locked themselves in their houses, while others, flying, communicated their fear to all they met, who stayed not to look behind them, but ran too. Insomuch that Shaibar and Prince Ahmed, as they went along, found the streets all desolate, till they came to the palace, where the porters, instead of keeping the gates, ran away too. So the prince and Shaibar advanced without any obstacle to the council hall, where the Sultan was seated on the throne and giving audience. There likewise the ushers, at the approach of Shaibar, abandoned their posts and gave them free admittance. Shaibar went boldly and fiercely up to the throne, without waiting to be presented by Prince Ahmed, and accosted the Sultan of the Indies with the words, "Thou hast asked for me?" said he. "See, here I am. What wilt thou have of me?" The Sultan, instead of answering him, clapped his hands before his eyes to avoid the sight of so terrible an object, at which uncivil and rude reception Shaibar was also much provoked. After he had given the trouble to come so far, they instantly lifted up his iron bar and killed him, before Prince Ahmed could intercede on his behalf. All that he could do was to prevent the killing of the Grand Vizier, who sat not far from him, representing him to that he had always given the Sultan his father good advice. "These are they," said Shaibar, "who gave him bad." And as he pronounced the words, he killed all the other viziers and flattering favorites of the Sultan, whom were Prince Ahmed's enemies. Yeah. Every time he struck, he killed someone or another, and none escaped but those who were not so frightened to stand staring and gaping, and who saved themselves by flight. When this terrible execution was over, Shaibar came out to the council hall into the midst of the courtyard with the iron bar upon his shoulder, and, looking hard at the Grand Vizier, who owed his life to Prince Ahmed, he said, "I know there's a certain magician who is a greater enemy of my brother-in-law than all the others who came before. I'll let the magician be brought to me presently." The Grand Vizier immediately sent for her, and as soon as she was brought, Shaibar said, at the time he fetched a stroke at her with his iron bar, "Take the reward of thy pernicious counsel, and learn to feign sickness again." After this he said, "This is not yet enough. I will use the whole town after the same manner if they do not immediately acknowledge Prince Ahmed, my brother-in-law, as the Sultan and the Sultan of the Indies." And then all that were present made the air echo again with the repeated acclamations of "Long live Sultan Ahmed!" And immediately after he was proclaimed through the whole town. Shaibar made him be clothed in royal vestments, installed him on the throne, and after he caused him all to swear homage and fidelity to him, went and fetched his sister Paribanou, whom he brought with all the pomp and grandeur imaginable, and made her to be owned Sultaness of the Indies. As for Prince Ali and Princess Nourhanar, as they had no hand in the conspiracy against Prince Ahmed, knew nothing of anything. Prince Ahmed assigned them a considerable province with its capital, where they spent the rest of their lives. Afterwards he sent an officer to Prince Hussein to acquaint him with the change, and make him an offer of which province he liked best. But that prince thought himself so happy in his solitude that he bade the officer return to the Sultan his brother thanks for the kindness he designed him, and assured him of his submission, and that the only favor he desired of him was to give him leave to live retired in the place he had made his choice for his retreat. That was a long and very convoluted story.